So it's lesson 11. I've just made an announcement on Blackboard and posted the link. So I'm going to encourage you, not force you, but encouraging you. Thanks to those of you. But I'm going to recommend, post your link so that you guys can see each other's work. And you can see the project of your partner that you reviewed for Lab 2. And I will get started marking these. I will have the marks done before next week's class. So I encourage you to add your URL here. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to continue on working with our single page application. So ran into a few small bugs towards the end of last week's class. I've cleaned those up. So I'm going to show you those fixes and then we'll continue on with our app. So I'm going to need, you'll want to open up your code editor, WebStorm, Visual Studio Code, whatever you're using. And we need to start both the backend server as well as our Angular client. So I'm going to need two terminal windows for this. Inside of WebStorm, in my root, I'm going to use NodeMon to launch the API server. And then I'm going to open a second command prompt. Which I'm terrible at opening. So I'm going to browse into my folder, my project folder. I'm going to go into my client folder, which is where our Angular app lives. Yes, Justin, we are opening this single page application. And then I also want to start the Angular server. So I'll use ng-serve and -- open, which will not only start the Angular application, but it will open it in my browser at localhost 4200. So my API is running in the root of my WebStorm terminal. And in my second command prompt, I'm going to use the ng-serve command to compile and run the Angular server. And then I'll show you there were two items. It says NodeMon is not recognized. That's interesting. Yeah, you could try installing it again. So I fixed a couple things here. I made three small changes. The first one is you may recall our table striping didn't work last week. So I'll show you the simple fix for that. So there's actually nothing wrong with our class. So in our project component.html, we had this on line 3, table, table striped, and table hover. But the striping didn't work. And the reason is in Bootstrap 5, in order for table stripe to work, it has to be applied inside the T body. So I didn't have these two T body tags last week. So our table, when we ended class, it looked like this. So the striping class doesn't work unless it's a child of the T body. So last week when we ended class, the table looked more like this. So by wrapping our TR loop inside of T body tags, that gets both the table striped and table hover classes working. So I had neglected to add the opening and closing T body tags that you now see on lines 9 and 15. So that was one formatting problem we had last week. Second issue had to do with formatting of the dates. So originally we had this. We had name, due date, and course. And our due dates were formatted this way, which looks pretty lousy and is confusing. So to format this with the date value only, we use the pipe symbol in Angular. This formats this value simply as a date. It would ignore any time values. So if in the due date you add a space, a pipe symbol, and then the keyword date, the little block of code I've highlighted in blue, this then just gives us a short date format. So those were two little fixes I made in the project component HTML, which we were working with last week, and that's in the source, client, source, app, and project. So that cleans up two of those items in the UI. There was also an little issue I was having in my project service, which was not files in client, source, app, services. We generated this project service.ts file last week. So I was trying to read our API server address from our globals file. So last week, we already had our database connection, but we added on the API server and the client server. So I wanted to be able to, rather than hard code in our path in our Angular service, we want to just read it from the configuration file. And I was importing the wrong thing. So here's my fix. We should be importing the API server variable from globals. So line 6, I think I tried importing the entire globals file. We just want to import this one value. We don't need anything else in there. And then when we make our call to the controller in our server, then we can just use the API server and append on /projects. So using the globals file last week, I think I tried it. I didn't reference it properly, and we wound up hard coding this full path as HTTP 3000/projects. But with the changes on line 6 and line 18, our path is now somewhat dynamic. It's not hard coded into our TypeScript. The path is being, the URL to the API is being read from our config file instead. So when I made this change, my data still loads here. So I think at the end of class last week, I had just commented this out and we had hard coded the path this way. And it still works like this. Still functioning, we still get our data loading, but not ideal. Better that we are not hard coding these things. So I'm going to keep this import of the API server variable, and I'm going to use it in our path. Okay, so those were the cleanup items I did after class last week. So the changes are in our project service and our project component.html. Are there any questions from anybody before we continue? So whenever our app loads now, it automatically fetches our data. And again, we have a whole bunch of layers to this. So as soon as we call the project component, right, when it's initialized, we call our get method. Our get method calls the project service. It calls the get projects method of our service. This method makes a get request to our Node Express API server at localhost 3000/project. So it calls the controller. Our controller is allowing requests from our Angular client. It allows get, post, put, delete, and options. And our get request finds all the projects and returns them in a JSON object. So if we load this, so if we want to load the API directly, we get a JSON representation of all the project data. So this is what Express sends back to the service. And our service returns this JSON to the component in this response. And our component takes this JSON response and sets our projects list equal to it. So then this projects variable holds that JSON with all of the project data. And then in our component, in our HTML, we used an ng-for to loop through the list of projects and generate a new table row for each one. So that's how our page is getting populated right now. So we can read the data, and this is happening automatically as soon as this page loads, as soon as our component gets initialized. Our component calls the service calls the controller, which hands JSON to the service, which hands the JSON to the component, which passes it to the HTML and loops through and displays our data. So the next thing we want to do is we also want to build in the ability on this same page to add a new project. So up at the top, above this list, well, we could do it above, or I suppose we could even do a little form beside. So we could make this kind of like a 2-column form where we have our list on the left and our form on the right. Maybe we'll try it that way. We'll try it this way. So we're going to put our table inside a div that's 8 columns wide. And then we'll make our form. So this will take up the left 2/3 of the page, and then our form can maybe appear on the right. So we'll put in a form. And we'll put on we'll just see how this looks for a moment. Okay, I wanted my form to appear over here. Oh, I may need this. I may need to wrap it all in a div class equals row. So I don't want my form underneath the table. If I wrap the whole thing in a class of row, we'll see what that does. There. And we'll give this a class of so now we want a field for due date and a field for course. Okay, so I had a div class equals row at the top. I put the table inside another div that's 8 columns wide, and then our form will go inside a div that's 4 columns wide. I'll name my second input due date. I'm just going to use a regular text box for the course. For now, I'm not going to worry about a drop-down list, just to keep it simple. So we've got 3 text boxes. The second one is a date. All of them are required. And we'll put on a save button. Just see how this looks. May as well style my button. I think we've got to make this a little wider. Try and make these. May need to play around and make our form a little bit wider. I change my columns to 3. Okay, that's probably good enough. So what we want to be able to do now is fill out the form, click save, and our new project should get automatically added to our list. And our form should clear out without us ever having to refresh the page. So I'll put all this up on Pastebin so far. mean, really, the only thing we've added here is some HTML and a bit of Bootstrap. I mean, we haven't put any Angular tags or directives on here yet. So we want to use Angular's two-way data binding to bind our name, due date, and course to the name, due date, and course properties of our component. And then we're going to need an add project method here. We're going to need an add project method in our service. And we're going to need a post method in our Express controller. So we'll kind of need three versions, three methods that will pass a new project along the chain of our application. From the UI to the component to the service to the server controller. So in order that we can add these Angular directives, we need to configure our Angular app to offer form support. And we did this in our original Angular app through the app module.ts. So if we had that file open from last week, because last week we added our service and our HTTP client module. We added the service as a provider, and we changed the bootstrap from app component to project component. So my app.module.ts is already open. If yours is closed, you can find it here under client, source, and app. You've got app.module.ts. This is kind of like the startup file for the Angular application. So open this file up, this app.module.ts, if you don't already have it open. Please open it up. In here, like we did in our first Angular project, we're going to import the Angular Forms module. So this allows us to work with HTML forms. So in our list of imports, we're going to add the forms module. So this is necessary. So needed for form data binding or add and edit. Okay, so if we want to connect individual field inputs on the form to properties of our Angular component, we've got to import the module and include it in the list of imports. So add line 11, as well as this code I've highlighted on line 20. We're probably done with this file, but we'll leave it open just in case there's any other configuration we need to do. Now that we've configured the forms module, we can go back to our HTML file and we can add the data binding on our inputs, as well as we want a click event on our button. So we're going to use ng model to bind the first text box to the name property of our component. And then we're going to do the same thing for the due date and the course, respectively. So we're setting up that two-way data binding so whatever value is in the form control is automatically connected to the project component. So we add square bracket, round bracket, ng model equals, and then we connect it up to our component property, which has the same name as the input. And then on our button, we're going to add an Angular click event, which we'll call add project. Excuse me. Now, this is failing right now simply because we don't have an add project method. So that's okay. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to go into the component. Sorry, this should be a method with brackets. Okay, so there's our completed form, at least for now. Later on, when we do editing, we're going to have to make some more changes to it, but this should be good for right now. So we've now done one of the 4 sets of changes we need. We've modified the HTML. So our next step is to go into our project component and create this add project method. So we have a get projects method. I'm now going to create an add project method. As soon as we do this, notice the error goes away in the HTML. Okay, it now sees the method that's going to be called when we click this button. Now we need to do a little more configuration for adding the project. We're going to use our service again. But when we add a project, we also have to submit a JSON object to the server. Right? We want to take the name, the due date, and a course as a JSON object, and we have to send that to the service, which will then post it to the controller. So when we called get, we weren't sending any data along with our request. We're just making a URL call. When we're adding or editing, though, we have to send data in to the database. So in order to do this, we're going to need to add an HTTP header to our request, which means we'll have to add a little configuration here. Just bear with me for a second. I want to make sure I get everything we need to do right. Okay. So we'll say let So we want to set the properties of a new project. So we're going to create a new project object from the form values. That's step 1. So when we say this dot name, it'll read the name input. This dot due date, whoops, and this should be this dot course. So read the 3 form values and populate our project. So again, we'll call our project service. But here, instead of calling get projects, we're going to call add project and pass in our new object, which will be JSON. And then we're going to call subscribe. Again, we're going to wait for a response. And once we get a response back, we want to update our list. So we're going to run our query to fetch the list of projects again. So we've got an error here. That's okay. We should have an error because our service doesn't yet have an add project method. So when the user clicks the button, they call add project. We take the three inputs, we map them to the three properties we've defined up here. They're all strings. And then we call our service, which is the bridge between our Angular app and our Node app. And we're going to call add project here. So now we've done two of the four components, created two of the four components that we need. So our third of four steps is to create the add project method in the service. Sorry, add project method in the service. Now, because I'm using WebStorm, it actually offers, hey, do you want to create an add project method in the project service, which I do. So I'm actually just going to click this. And now it creates the method for me, but not quite how I want it. So it creates an add project. I think I can just take out this definition. So when we call add project, it's going to receive a JSON object. So again, we're going to call this.http. If we're adding a new project, which HTTP method do we want to use? Here we used get. Which method should we use this time when we're going to add a new document? If you look at the list of what's available, do we want delete, get, head, JSONP, options, patch, post, put, or request? Which methods generally used for creating new resources? Anyone? There's a link here on Blackboard. We did this last semester. I put a link up, REST API HTTP verbs. So these are the different types of HTTP methods that are common when we're building a REST API. So which method do we want to use for creating a new resource? Thank you, Maggie. We want to use post. And typically it will return, if it's successful, a 201 response. So we're going to call post at the same URL as our get. API server. And now we'll pass in our new project. I think there's one more thing we're going to need to modify here. But we'll try it this way and see. Okay, so now notice the red line in my component goes away. We now have a method in the service called add project that takes in a project object, sends it to the service, and then refreshes the data from the component. I have a feeling we're going to need to add one more thing here, but we'll try it this way first. So here's the new method in the service. So our last step is then to write the post method in our node controller, in server controllers projects.js. So once you've added your add project method in the service, we've done 3 of the 4. Again, our first round of changes was building the form with our Angular directives. The second change was creating the add project method in our component that calls our service. Our service has an add project method that calls the server API. It does a post method at the same URL, but it's passing in a JSON object. So now we can go to our controller and create a post method at /projects. So in the root of the controller, we'll call project.create with our request body. And we will get back either an error or a project. If we have an error, we'll send back some kind of error response as JSON. We'll send a 501 response if our post fails. Otherwise, we'll send back our new project with an HTTP status of 201, which is resource created. So there's our post method for our API. We'll use our Mongoose model to create a project from the request body. We'll evaluate if we got an error or a new document returned to us. So now we should be able to try our form out. And let's see what happens. As I said, we may be missing a configuration option that we'll need in the service, but we'll try it this way and see. So I'm going to fill something out here. Okay, so you can see it adds right away, right? Our page never reloaded. Excuse me. As soon as I click save, it adds to the database, right? And then what happens in our component, as soon as we're finished calling add, it then calls the get method again, which fetches the project list. So it seems almost instant. We should do one other thing in the UI. What else should we do when we finish adding a project? It's saving and updating. We should do one other quick thing. What should happen in the UI once we're done saving a new project and we can see it get added to the list? From a user perspective, what should happen over on the right after I save a new project? Okay, everyone's quiet today. I'd like to clear out the form. So after we save a project and it updates our list, I want to wipe out these form values. So in my component, I'm going to add a new method here called clear form. So all we want to do is say this.name. We're going to null these values out. So in our add project, after we refresh the list, I then want to call clear form, which will wipe out the name, due date, and course, which should clear our 3 form inputs. So I'm going to try this one more time. As soon as this is working, I think it should work like this. I will upload everything to GitHub and we'll have a break. So I'll add again. Just put something in. And when I save, not only should this get added to my list, but my form should clear out. So because we have this two-way data binding, when we change any property's value in the component, it automatically will update the HTML component that's bound to that property with ng model. So there's our two-way data binding. When we are saving, we're binding from the HTML to the component. When we're clearing the form, we're binding from the component back to the HTML with that ng model. I'm going to upload everything we've done so far to Git. Are there any questions before we take a break and come back to do our delete and update functionality? Okay. Thanks. All right, I'm going to pause the recording. We will take a 10-minute break and come back at 1:05. Everything's been uploaded to GitHub if you need to reference anything.